Now the next thing I would want is, as I mentioned before, now that we have our simulation set up and given some initial motion in the larger domain, and also with the random node also giving it some more local details, but we would like real waves coming from here and hitting here over these rocks. That was the initial idea. And for this we create a simple wave maker. And we know the wave makers from some real world scale models of wave tanks. And these wave makers are simply some obstacles that are moving back and forth and are creating some waves. And that's also the idea that we take over here to create some nice waves in Effects 2.0. Let's give this a size so it is inside of the water but not on the floor like this. We want the water to flow, to be able to flow under it, so it can create vortices here and here. Alright, but like this, and the idea is to make it move back and forth, so it generates the waves that are coming from here and splashing over here. Alright, so what we need, of course, again, is a volume. And I simply, as it should be an obstacle, I can simply copy now that coast obstacle volume and replace, I put it down here, the wave maker, and I rename it to wave maker and put the cube in here instead. And as we can see again by the reddish display here that it has been registered, and it looks like the inside is correctly catched by the system. Now I could create waves with this one. And what I do is, instead of keyframing it, I use a Cinema 4D tag, which is perfectly done for this one. And it's a vibration tag, vibrate expression. And we choose the regular pulse because it has to go in a regular pulse back and forth. That's our idea. And we want the position to change, so I enable position, and we want it to move along the z-axis and a little bit to the x-axis. We have a little bit here along the axis. I keep it at 20 maybe, and this one I put to, I don't know, 30. That could fit, making the frequency lower because it will be probably pretty fast. And now I turn off the effects scene because I wanted to calculate, now that I moving this thing, I want to check if this is the right thing I want. Yeah, that looks exactly like what I want actually. The speed is fine. Remember, this is 40 meters in the real world, so this movement might be, I don't know, 5 meters back and forth, something like this. I could also increase this and a little more. I like that one. We also have it as an obstacle already. That's all we need to do. You know, just go back now, activate the effects scene. And now you can see that there's already power injected here. That's actually what we need to create a scene with an open water wake and some wave splashing. And again, you can use a lot more wave makers for your own scene. So let's get to creating foam and spray now. First thing we need to do, at least this time I show you one way to create foam and spray. There are two ways actually now, because we have two algorithms in this framework for creating foam and spray. But we will be using the geometry part of the foam and spray generation. That's why we need to do this now, these steps. Also important for visualizing this whole thing is we need a surface now, because if we render the scene, so we can now see there's nothing actually, we don't see the water body being rendered. We just see the example landscape and floor, ocean floor. All right, not enough for us. So let's change this, and by creating a surface reconstructor and an implicit measure. We create both. The first one, the surface reconstructor, is exactly doing what he says. He reconstructs a surface from all the particles that we have here. So let's drop it in here. Surface reconstructor, and in its settings we need the particle group, and we choose the one that we have, that our liquid particles belong to. And you can already see that also this surface reconstructor shows this reddish display in the editor showing the inside of our water body now, which is looking exactly like it should. We can also, I always do this, it's just a tip, using another kernel, so another fall off, and we create a fall off kernel object here. I do this in here directly. This is much faster, and I choose the polynomial because it also catches a lot of details. Let's put it like this. I can show you this by now dragging the implicit measure also in here, and we need to define a volume. That's the necessary thing, and we choose our surface reconstructor that we just generated like this, and now we can also see the surface being generated here. And let's just try this and take off the kernel completely, like clear, and we can see that now we have particles standing above the surface actually, because of the kernel. It's a cubic kernel used by default. And let's just put it back in again, and we have the polynomial. We could also choose different kernel, like smooth for example, which is much smoother but also doesn't catch the details here. Well, I like the polynomial, it's pretty nice. The second thing that is probably useful is changing the voxel scale. For now it is the voxel scale of the simulation, which we have here, and currently is 0.3 meters, so 1/10 of the conversion rate here that we have, because we have 3 meters for 100 centimeters. So this is also the voxel scale used for the surface reconstructor. If we want these cells, these voxels, to be smaller for the reconstructor, which is definitely a good idea, well, for preview purposes, 1 might be okay. It's fast, it's easy, and you don't have to change anything. But you should use a voxel scale of 2 or higher, at least for the final version. You know, so you get, first of all, a smoother result here. Let's just put this to 1 again so you can see the difference. Like this, we get here more artifacts. It's not very clean here because we don't have many particles. So you should use a value of 2, definitely, especially if you're using the normal modes and the implicit measure. It takes longer, but it's worth it. We get a much smoother appearance. I also increase the neighbor count that will be found, which is also important the higher we go with the voxel scale, because it should catch more particles, of course. All right, so now what we do is we can lower our particle radius. Let's put it to 0.6, which will give us a much more detailed surface. As you can see here now, it's not as thick anymore as before. Let's go now to the measure, also having some options. Especially useful is the Inviscid Liquid Solver to set it here. By setting it here, we have the time step option down here that is now working. So if I put this to 0, you can see that the surface is shifting like this, because the surface is now transported by the velocity field used in the simulation, so the motion field. But you got to be careful with this one, because we can see now here in this area, for example, if you look closely, that there is no collision between the polygons. So at some point they will be overlapping, but a little bit like this is always always works. All right, but let's just keep it off for now. Can do this for the final rendering now, and then I'm just saving some performance here when we are working with our setup. Also, an important setting in here are either algorithm, first of all, because the margin cubes, well, it's pretty fast, but it can also show some artifacts. It's pretty good for previews. But for your final rendering, you should use margin tats. You can see here that some artifacts disappear like this. And the best algorithm is the margin tats, which gives very smooth surfaces and still pretty fast. But that's also something for the final rendering actually. So I choose margin cubes, which is fast. And we have the isosurface at value. The surface reconstructor is an implicit field actually. It's like a sphere that can be expressed with a mathematical formula. So you know at any time where the surface is. If we look at the implicit measure and this isosurface, in this case it is 0, and this would be the exact point on the reconstructed surface of our water body. By changing this value, I can move this surface. So expanding, actually, it's like expanding and shrinking, you know. At some point, because the surface is only defined in an area around where the particles are, we get these artifacts. So this makes no sense. You probably always will use a positive value here and a value between, you choose values between 0 and 1. So everything else is probably not making any sense. And you should definitely do this.